For part two, we are going to, I think, reset the table up here, talking about the technology companies, the tech industry in various forms and its relationship to cybersecurity threats. And what's fascinating, I think, about our panel up here is that we have this from three very different perspectives. So let me introduce our panelists. Furthest from me is Erika Brownlee. She's the Senior Vice President and Assistant General Counsel for Privacy and Data Protection at Mastercard. She previously held key roles at the DOJ and the FTC. Between Erika and me, coming down to the row here, Glenn Gerstell is the General Counsel for the National Security Agency. And sitting next to me here is Tim Wu. He's a professor at Columbia University, a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times, and the author of the book, The Curse of Bigness. So I think we can talk about this idea of policing tech or the relationship with these tech companies in many different ways. And Glenn, I was hoping you could set the table for us based on something you wrote for the New York Times a few weeks ago. You had a piece for the Times Privacy Project where you said the digital revolution has urgent and profound implications for our federal and national security agencies. It is almost impossible to overstate the challenges. So since you're the government participant here, try to state the challenges. Tell us why it is so difficult to state those challenges when it comes to the future state of affairs for cybersecurity.
Okay, Brian, thank you, and thanks to the Aspen Institute for doing this and bringing us here, and all of you in the audience. So what I want to focus on first, obviously, is what we're all here for about, which is the cybersecurity threat. So I think all of us sense that we're in some kind of global pandemic in the area of cybersecurity, and unfortunately, although we'll talk about some solutions and remedies in this panel, I want to start off on the negative side, if you'll indulge me for a second.
We need to, yeah.
With the global pandemic example, and say that unfortunately, I think the state of cybersecurity is going to get worse before it gets better. We probably, I don't know how many years we have of it, but the problem is going to get a little worse, and we're going to have to figure out how do we adapt to that, and then ultimately how do we get ahead of it. But it's getting worse for really three reasons. One, technology perversely is making it easier to mount cyber attacks. Cyber tools are more easily available to common criminals. We have some roughly 40-odd nation states now that are capable of offensive cyber activity. It's fairly easy to do. We see countries such as, take Russia, for example. You don't need to be an economic powerhouse to do this. Russia's a country with the GDP, the GDP that is equal to the combined GDP of Illinois and Pennsylvania, and yet look at the havoc is able to wreak in the cyber domain. Other countries that from the intelligence agency we particularly are focused on are North Korea, Iran, and China. China obviously being a major and very much rising power. All four of those countries have national strategies to employ cyber as an offensive weapon, but we're seeing other countries involved in it too, and as I said, also cyber criminals. So put that all together. So point one is it's just easier. We have a greater number of people engaged in cyber malicious activity, and it's easier to do. Secondly, as the military folks like to say, the attack surface is getting bigger. What do I mean by that? Well, the advent of everything we've been talking about, which is the Internet of Things with some 20 billion odd devices connected to the Internet. When you wake up tomorrow morning, there are going to be 5 million more, and you wake up the next morning, there's going to be another 5 million. It's the sheer number of the devices connected, the advent of 5G, the significance of artificial intelligence, which will soon be governing significant portions of our everyday commercial and personal lives. You put that all together, so we're dealing with a situation in which malicious cyber activity can operate at a far more pervasive level and have a really, unfortunately, ubiquitous effect. And then finally, as a result of the second point, which is the significance of this, the actual data itself that is at the heart of this, that is the foundation and the product of this digital revolution, is itself more valuable. We're getting increasingly valuable data on personal matters. We're getting increasingly valuable data in the hands of the private sector as well as government, but principally the private sector, that will be driving the critical algorithms in artificial intelligence that will be governing our lives, our future digital lives in many respects. So the value of data is greatly increased and its criticality is significant. So therefore, the consequences of a cyber attack with much greater, will have much greater significant outcomes. I think this, and I'll turn this over to the rest of the panel, but I think this problem, the fact that the problem is going to increase at a rate probably greater than the rate we're going to be able to find a solution, so we need to figure out how do we adapt to that dynamic, ultimately before it gets better, and I think it ultimately will get better, is what I think presents challenges for us in the area of figuring out the public-private relationship to deal with this, privacy issues. A whole host of problems are generated by this particular outcome.
Erika, do you agree with that assessment that we're going through unimaginable technological changes?
Absolutely. And thank you to Aspen Institute. It's a pleasure to be here. I do agree. I think that it's a slightly pessimistic outlook, but with room for some optimism. One of the things I think that this panel underscores, and even this day, is just that cybersecurity is something that really isn't an area that's left anymore to the IT departments of companies. It's at the board level, and boards are engaged in certainly raising awareness, in establishing the preparation for incidents, as Glenn was talking about, and then they're sort of engaged in this cybersecurity strategy as well. And so I think that also sets the stage for the importance of where we are in our cyber journey. I think we do have a long way to go. It does raise a lot of different concerns. It's only going to, as Glenn mentioned, get more complicated. But we do have, I think, an opportunity to look at the way we approach cyber defenses and responses in a way to address the problem. And so one of the things I think that we really want to make sure as we talk through some of the privacy issues is from a consumer perspective. We look at we've looked at from individuals and certainly as citizens, but also providing that experience for consumers who want privacy as well as transparency, and they want security as well as convenience. And so I think those are somewhat aspects that are at odds, but I do think that we have an opportunity to provide the foundation for achieving those.
I think something that comes through in both of what you're saying is the idea that there will be times where there will be failures, where people will not be entirely safe in this from this perspective. Glenn, you were basically saying that there are going to be times when the government and industry cannot keep up with these evolving threats, and that has to be accepted, perhaps, or acknowledged. Is that fair to say?
I think that's correct, Brian. I think it's a mistake, and I think all of us in the audience here know that we're not going to find the magic, as they say, silver bullet or something. Cybersecurity is not going to be something that we're going to be able to solve with a one-size-fits-all solution. It's a complex problem, and as our world moves ever more along the spectrum to a fully digital world, we're going to have a multiplicity of problems to deal with. So there isn't going to be one easy solution. So I liken this more to a situation, not that I enjoy using this analogy, but it's instead of having a disease or situation that's going to be cured, we're going to be dealing with a situation that's more of a chronic condition, and we need to cope with and adapt to it. And I think the more we can focus on resilience and ways of having a multiplicity of defenses in this area, and having public-private partnerships to join together to make the most of what each sector can contribute, I think we'll be on the path to this being able to cope with what is an ongoing situation. We've all heard the analogy that whether it's the hockey analogy or something else, where it's always going to be easy to find a way in to provide disruption, and you're never going to get a perfectly secure system that is completely immune to all cyber threats. I think everyone understands that. So the question is, under that circumstance, how do you go about arraying the public and private sectors to address that ongoing problem?
And just one more question for you. People don't get to hear from the NSA very often. As the NSA's top lawyer, do you feel the U.S. has a coherent cybersecurity strategy today? Is that clear?
Yes, I think we do. We have it's an ongoing thing, as to my point just a minute ago, which is there's no one solution. The United States government, I think, has a robust and increasingly developed and sophisticated approach to this. It's complicated. We have a large number of agencies and departments, ranging from my agency, which does have involvement in the cybersecurity area, but focus particularly on the Department of Defense and critical infrastructure, critical weapons systems. The Department of Homeland Security that engages with the public and deals with critical infrastructure. The Secret Service, for example, that helps deal with the banking and financial industry. The FBI, which engages with the public generally in terms of criminal matters relating to cybersecurity. So there's a multiplicity of parties involved, at least on the government side, let alone the private sector. But I do think the government does have an integrated approach to this. We saw, just one last quick comment, we saw the benefits of that kind of integrated approach in the midterm elections, which, as I think you heard the Secretary of Homeland Security say, the most recent ones in 2018 were the safest elections we've had to date in terms of cybersecurity. So when the government does get together in an integrated way, I think it can produce good outcomes.
Tim, how does this conversation resonate with you? I mentioned you're the author of The Curse of Bigness. I think of you as Mr. Antitrust, thinking about the big tech companies that are based out west and their relationships to consumers. How does this resonate with you?
Sure. Well, thanks a lot, and thanks for having me here. First of all, I'm interested in how you characterize the problem because it makes me think that it's a public policy challenge that is a little bit more like the control of criminality, or maybe war during certain periods of history where it isn't ever finished. I mean, it seems like I've read some of the histories of cyber conflict, and it's constant. It's almost some state of constant warfare. And that seems to me a very, different than the way we think, although we have had a very long war in Afghanistan. But, generally speaking, you think of these sort of discrete problems that might be solved. Obviously, the United States has not solved the criminality problem, but it seems that the challenge, the public policy challenge, is a kind of a different one. The thing I wanted to bring up, I think is relevant to cybersecurity. I'm not an expert in cybersecurity, but I am very interested in how the privacy laws, or the new privacy laws and the movements to create new privacy laws, and the antitrust enforcement action, which is starting up right now, will interact with cybersecurity. I don't think it's something people are, maybe you're thinking about it. I don't know if privacy advocates are thinking about it strongly. I know there's begin to be some debates in the antitrust enforcement area. Some of the defenses by some of the major tech companies say, well, you can't come after us too hard, or you'll disable our ability to defend the United States. And so it just kind of goes to your point that we're going beyond this idea. It's a sort of little thing that a bunch of very talented people take care of, and becoming something that is involved in the larger public policy discussions about privacy and antitrust.
Erika, how do we get that balance right? I mean, protecting data, providing individuals with the right to control their data. There are, these conversations about privacy laws that may or may not end up being passed. How do you see that?
Well, certainly there's it's an interesting time from a privacy perspective with regard to, as it relates to cybersecurity. Cyber and privacy are quite related in that you can't have a privacy program if you don't really have, the protections that surround it. And so there's really been a trend from regulators to really push on companies and other entities to think through and think about how to protect consumers with regard to their privacy, because consumers also think that there is this sort of overload of protection that's part of what they experience. Because if you think about from a password perspective, we're sort of bombarded with passwords, and it seems that almost for every human interaction you need to have a strong password with numbers and letters. And yet there are breaches. And so the trend is for regulators to push upon companies to shift the responsibility onto entities to provide those protections. And so that's what you see with the cybersecurity laws. In particular, there's this trend, as Tim was mentioning, and one of them is coming out of California, which is a law that will go into effect in January, that will be, it has cyber aspects and will give private right of action. So in other words, individuals would be able to sue for violations of data breach. So that's just one example. But of course, we have the European model in the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which provides up to 4% of a penalty for breaches, including cyber, and coming across to the US, US regulators have imposed millions and billions in fines. So there's this trend towards pushing upon companies to incorporate privacy and cyber security by design, as well as privacy by design, as they build their products, and in a way that empowers consumers to feel safe.
Tim?
Brian, can I add a just comment? I think I completely agree with what Erika said, and I'd like to say that I think we're moving to a situation where it's going to be a little different from the ordinary dynamic we've had with so many other aspects of our economic life, where the private sector and commercial sector is free to largely do what it wants, pursuing its completely appropriate commercial decisions with appropriate levels of regulation and oversight for government in certain areas, and then government over here doing its own thing for public good. And I think cyber, to your end, is going to force us, because of its pervasive nature, the sheer ubiquity of it and the criticality of it to all society, is going to force on some level our public and private sectors to have a much greater level of cooperation and collaboration, not just simple regulation. So it's not just simply going to be regulations that you must have certain cybersecurity initiatives and must report breaches, et cetera. That'll be part of it, to be sure. But I think government is going to need to figure out a way to take classified information that it now has and somehow make it available in some appropriate form to the private sector to enable it to take action in a timely basis to defend itself. And then similarly, the private sector has a large role to play here too, which is that the private sector, with all of the large antivirus companies and the extraordinary networks that the private sector has, which are much greater than the federal government's when you put them in the aggregate. So the private sector, and they, after all, are the targets of most of the malicious activity. I mean, the government is too, but much more the private sector. So somehow getting the information about the nature of cyber incidents and threats and vulnerabilities into the hands of the government to help it enrich its thinking to protect, for the purpose of protecting our country, are something we're going to have to figure out how to do. There's lots of issues embedded in that, to be sure.
Are you seeing that already working? Are there instances where you can point to and say this worked?
Well, there are. We have the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI already have significant outreach efforts. I think probably everyone would concede that more could be done. Internally within the National Security Agency, for example, just a couple of days ago, our director announced the stand-up of a separate cybersecurity directorate for the purpose of combining in sort of under one roof, so to speak, a way for us to engage with the Department of Homeland Security, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and in certain limited cases, the public and the defense industry, to have a sort of one particular focal point for cybersecurity initiatives. So I do think there are efforts on the part of government to do that. There certainly are efforts on the part of industrial sectors to get together and organize themselves with respect to this. But again, I think we'd all probably concede that it's an evolving journey and more can be done.
Yeah, and to get to that bridge of what you're talking about, which is, sort of having companies or really government, the role of government in collaborating with companies. If we are going to be able to protect consumer data, we definitely have to have that flip side of understanding how to collaborate with government and with other companies to be able to protect the data that we have. And so, when you think about those three ways, right, which of collaboration, governments collaborating with other governments, and I think somebody in the other panel talked about that there was a lot of that going on behind the scenes. I think that's really positive to hear. But in terms of government-private sector, I think that that's really a critical aspect, and you touched upon the new entity that you have. It builds also from the sharing that we see under the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act. That is both sharing with government and with private sector. It allows private companies to share not only defensive information about cybersecurity threats, but it also allows companies to share with each other. I think that that's an important angle. So I think that whether it's from government to government and private sector within our industry and across industries, I think is really important.
And all of this, Tim, as I think about it, it raises the word trust in my mind. Will citizens, will consumers trust these collaborative efforts?
Well, that's a good question. You might ask if they have any choice when, increasingly fewer entities in some of these spaces. But I want to circle back to something that was just being talked about and slightly turn on a more advocate's hat here, which is I've come to think that the failure of this country to pass privacy laws, people have been talking about it for about, at least 19 years, strong privacy laws in this area, really does seem to have created some vulnerabilities. I mean, when you think about, and it's not often presented this way. Debate, maybe outside of this circle, is always about, to make privacy laws, too much interference by government and so forth. But, we've had so many privacy breaches. There's so much unnecessary data being collected. There's so much of it floating around there that I think it contributes to some of these problems that you're describing. And now we have a law in California, which will take place in 2020. I'm not sure how that will be, but the federal government is still stuck. And it's extraordinary because when you look at public opinion polls, for example, how many people want a stronger privacy law? I want, going back to your trust question, how many people feel that they don't really trust what's going on there? It's like 70–80% of people want something done, but Congress just cannot get something done in this area, and I think it's creating an additional vulnerability. It may be that ultimately the national security agencies end up being the ones who force privacy in a not through the back door in some ways or through a sideways process. But it does seem like a major problem in my view.
And with regards to a lot of the external debate about tech companies today, most of the political arguments about technology companies and about big tech, it's about whether these should be broken up, about whether these should continue in their current structures. We're going to continue to hear about that in the Democratic primaries for months to come. Tim, the argument from the tech companies is if you break us up, we're not as able to protect our users. We're not as strong to be able to protect in these areas. What do you say to that?
Yeah, that's in fact the most recent version of it was Mark Zuckerberg himself during the leaked conversations he was having at Facebook. So that is the argument. There is, as you said, a strong movement headed both by the states and the federal government to reinforce the antitrust laws and possibly break up some of the companies. When you say break up, it's actually a divestiture of what I believe were illegal acquisitions. So in the case of Facebook, the Instagram and WhatsApp acquisitions, for example, may not have been in compliance with the Clayton Act. So that's what we're talking about. And Facebook's argument, as you just said, one of them is that, well, if that happens, national security be threatened because we have the resources to protect everybody. Well, I don't know if Facebook has the best track record in this area, first of all. The 26th election, people here would probably know better than me. And it also strikes me that there is danger in having just a few really large targets, especially when we're talking about national government. That was one of the challenges, it's always been one of the challenges of the window operating system. It was like the one monopoly, the one obvious target. And Apple, which has always had a smaller subscriber base, had comparatively less attacks. So I think there's some danger. I don't think you actually need the scale of an industry-wide monopoly to have an effective security program. A lot of companies that have security programs that are not, over $60 billion in revenue. So I basically don't buy it. I mean, I'm involved in these cases myself, but I think it's exaggerated and shouldn't be listened to. There is some size in which companies become too small to have security, but I don't think the breakups go anywhere near that.
All right, on the complete flip side, Glenn, are the tech companies strong partners for the government right now? Are you getting what you need from the tech companies?
I think broadly, yes. I mean, as I said, I think what we are trying to move to is a much greater and richer level of public-private partnership. You've all seen some press reports alluding to the fact that there remains on some level a Washington Silicon Valley divide. There was some press reports about some folks, I think it was, if I remember correctly, at Google, who didn't want Google to be involved in a particular Department of Defense contract. So
Right.
there are important societal debates to be had about some of these issues, and I'm going to obviously not step into that area. But just I would just simply say that I do think the tech company is aware of its the tech industry is aware of its responsibility, its critical role in America. We've seen efforts on the part of social media companies after the 2016 election to address some of the issues about social media platforms, whether it's ranging something the societal issues of child pornography to election interference, et cetera. So again, I feel this is an evolving area. I don't think it's a simple yes/no binary switch. People are cooperating, not cooperating. No, I think it's a more complex issue. But I think we are on the right path. And as I said before in my opening comments, we're absolutely on the right path. The question is, that particular path may be at an angle that's pretty good, and the problem is coming at us at a slightly higher angle. And so I think the challenge for all of us, both public and private, is to recognize that under circumstances in which there's this divergence, this delta, this gap, how do we cope with it? What's the most efficient way for our country to deal with the fact that we're not going to get ahead of it right away? Maybe 20 years from now with the Aspen Cyber Forum in the year 2040, we'll say, remember that problem we had with cybersecurity? Yeah, that was a funny little problem. It'd be nice to think that, but we're not there yet.
Is that possible, Erika?
Well, I do think that even if we don't have a national privacy law anytime soon, we'll see how that goes in the coming months. But I do think that we need a comprehensive strategy or plan of action for cyber. So that collaboration across governments, I think, we look to set out a national standard or a standard that is globally interoperative so that we can have that baseline, I think, of cybersecurity protections. I do think that companies sort of need to think through, and something that we think about, that you can't fight cyber alone. There really is something called a collective defense, and we're stronger if we can collaborate, as I said, not just even within our sector, but across sectors that involve critical infrastructure. I touched upon CISA, but there's also some support for even going beyond just sharing of cybersecurity threat indicators and thinking about sharing, the actual challenges and the weaknesses and the strengths of a cybersecurity program. And so I think that also is something that would be a step in the right direction to, again, raise that level. There is that asymmetry between companies, large and small, medium-sized businesses. Not everyone has the resources or the ability to create an effective cybersecurity program, but because of the interconnected devices, I don't remember the number you threw out, but billions. We're all 20. We're only as strong as the weakest link, and so that really is something that affects us all. So I do think that those are, critical aspects of this conversation. And then you do have the privacy side, because you need to be able to do so in a way, and I don't think it's mutually exclusive, but you need to do so in a way that does not erode the protection of individual privacy, but then still contributes to the greater good of protection.
What stayed with me was that number 5 million a day, that every day 5 million more devices will be connected. We do have time for questions from the audience. Raise your hand so we'll bring you a mic. Tim, you wanted to react to what Erika was saying?
I just want to react to or discuss this issue of the tech industry and its contributions. So when I worked in government, I found, especially the big tech platforms, they're very helpful, very friendly, they're very good government relations. People, we're going to help you with the problems that you're facing. And, I think that's good. It's better than the opposite. On the other hand, we can't ignore the fact that they're also creating a lot of the problems in the first place with a business model that relies on, Facebook's, for example, and profiling every single person in the United States and, in a sense, creating a surveillance apparatus in private hands. Google, similarly, just over a collection of private data, and also fighting in Congress some of the measures to deal with it. Now, they will occasionally say they're interested in regulation, but the results are, as they say, it by its fruits. We've had a lot of efforts to have privacy laws over the last 15 years, and nothing's out of it. So it is a two-handed thing. There's a lot of cooperation, a lot of we're on your side, but then also a lot of creation of vulnerabilities.
But perhaps, Tim, I would say consumers are voting every day and logging in every day, and they're choosing every day.
That's true, but we've never had the position, I think, especially when it comes to national security, that the consumer is totally sovereign over the fate of our country. There are other challenges created by the advertising model, the big data mining that we've undertaken. It's created real social challenge. I mean, some of what you're talking about can be described as the offshoots of a big data business model, and then that has created this crisis which you're talking about. It's without the level of data collection and surveillance that we've had privately over the last 20 years, I don't think we would have the dire situation we have today. And the threats I saw in state government and also in federal government. So I want to say it's a two-sided picture. And I think control of these business models and control of some of the power of big tech is important for getting a handle on cybersecurity.
Let's see if we have questions from the audience. We have microphones on either side, so anybody who wants to raise a hand, we'll bring a microphone down to you. Here's one over here on the side over here.
Professor Wu, I was wondering if you could speak to the notion of whether consumers actually have choice and whether or not some of the policies of tech companies mean that effectively they don't have choice. I think the WhatsApp model, before Facebook acquired it, there used to be a more privacy protective option. Now there's not.
Right. That's a very good point about basically Facebook or monopoly in general. So monopoly tends to imply a lack of choice, and you could always go without Google or Facebook and Amazon and so forth. But it's hard. It's getting harder and harder, right, to live. You kind of become a hermit. When I was in the federal government, when I worked at the FTC, I remember we were investigating Google, so we used Bing all the time. And it got hard after a while. And I think you make a really important point, which is some of these acquisitions have eliminated rival business models. So WhatsApp was the pioneer of a messaging service that charged $1 a year. And so subscription-based, very privacy protective. They're still relatively privacy protective, but they eliminated the subscription as a competitive business model. And I do think consumers lose something when we have entire business models eliminated through acquisitions or through failures of antitrust enforcement. So I think it relates to some of these cyber security questions ultimately.
Any other questions from the audience? I'll look for any other hands. We have one more hand over here. We'll see if we can fit this in.
It seems that one of the challenges is a misalignment of incentives. We see that manufacturers of technical products or motor vehicles reap the financial benefits of their product, and when those products prove defective, they bear the financial costs of repairs in the form of recalls. But with software and technical products, we tend not to do this. Similarly, on the user end, there are responsibilities to not drive while impaired, or to wear your glasses, or keep your headlights on at night. Where do we see anything changing in terms of allocating liability to people who have financial incentives to correct the problem and the wherewithal to those who bear the benefits?
I don't want to take up all the room, but you want to.
Well, it sounds like what you're talking about, so I think that's a great question. From a privacy perspective, it really strikes me as hitting on that concept of accountability. You know, how are we accountable for using people's data, for you know, what we say about how we're going to use it and how long we're going to share it, or how long we're going to keep it, and how do we share it. And so I think accountability from a privacy perspective is absolutely important and critical. And I'll let my other panelists talk further about that. But you know, just to say that that's part of that shift that we're seeing, so that it's not just about individuals having the onus to prove or to show that they have had their privacy violated, but rather for companies and enterprises to take the steps to proactively assess what the risks are and address them. And if they don't address them, then to be accountable.
Yeah, if I can just jump in for one second. You know, I wonder if we'll look back at some of the big data business models and some of the vulnerabilities I think they've created in cybersecurity risks. Kind of think about, you know, companies in the 20th century who just like, you know, pollution wasn't a deal. They just did it, you know, dumped stuff into the river and, you know, made their money that way. Because the country is bearing a cost, as you're pointing out, and you know, the budget in this area is getting larger. And I think we may look back at this period and think, like, what were we thinking? And why? And there was a period where we wanted to subsidize Silicon Valley. Everything was new. And, you know, Americans love new and exciting stuff. And I think that's good. But there's a natural cycle where you got to ask, like, you know, maybe the vulnerabilities created by this business model are something that they need to internalize, which is exactly what the questioner is saying.
And Glenn, with our last minute, let me take it back to what you said in the very beginning. You used the word resilience. And I think as these debates rage on, and there are many of these debates that we've alluded to in the last half an hour, everybody involved, all the stakeholders, have to become more resilient, knowing that what's ahead is, as you said, going to be worse before it gets better.
I think that's exactly right. I think the solution here is going to be not that we will suddenly devise, as I said earlier, a cybersecurity defense that is going to be perfect across a multiplicity of industries and applications, et cetera. The world is getting way too complicated to even dream of that as any kind of panacea. So the solution, I think, is going to be a very complex solution involving, as I've said before, public-private partnerships, recognizing the nature of the vulnerabilities, increasing sharing, developing more resilience. And we see that in one tiny area, for example, which is election security. There's a great move on now to have paper ballots as a backup. That's fine and makes a lot of sense. But if we're going to be talking about making sure the city of the future, the digital city of the future, is safe against a malicious cyber attack that goes against the algorithms that control the lights and turn all the lights in, say, Manhattan or New York red, we're not, the analog to that is not to have a policeman on every street, or a policewoman or whatever. So that's not the solution. So we are going to have to be creative in figuring out what's the appropriate way to have a level of resilience as we get increasingly digital, and I think that is the challenge. I'm confident we can ultimately overcome it, but it is the challenge.
Glenn, Erika, and Tim, thank you so much. Thank you to our panel. Thank you to all of you, and thank you to Aspen.